On November 30th, 2022, ChatGPT would release to the world. What would follow soon after are hordes of students who would finally figure out a way to get their homework done for free and with zero effort. However, as time went by, many others would start to increasingly rely on AI. Not just with small errands or things that help them become more productive at work, but also major life milestones, like love, relying on this AI chatbot to be their partner in life. And while I'm very happy for these people and can't wait for the wedding, there's a very big problem. And that's the fact that ChatGPT is far from perfect. In fact, it can hallucinate. One great recent example is someone asking it, "Hey, I want to wash my car, but the car wash is very, very close to my house. Should I walk there or drive there?" The obvious answer is drive there because you want to wash your car. What does ChatGPT say? Walk to the car wash. To do what exactly? I don't know. Just walk. Trust me. This is not an isolated incident by any means. There have been countless studies delving into these hallucinations or instances of AI psychosis, which encourage the user into delusional thinking. And this has nothing to do with a particular demographic. Anyone can fall victim to this delusion, including the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar video game conglomerate. He would embrace the delusion so much offered to him by ChatGPT that he would start to ignore the legal counsel of the lawyers that work for him. He would make up a plan with ChatGPT to avoid having to pay $250 million, yes, $250 million in a deal that he had already agreed to. ChatGPT would fuel his delusions, telling him, yes, you can totally do this. The result? One of the most embarrassing lawsuits in video game history. It would turn out that every single thing that the CEO did was outlined clearly by ChatGPT in a step-by-step basis. He literally let it take control of his entire life. It was incredibly humiliating to both the CEO and his company, ruining the reputation they had so carefully built for so many years over a mistake that even an intern wouldn't make. I've been following this story closely ever since it began in the summer of 2025, and now that it's finally come to somewhat of a conclusion, we have to talk about it because it's truly unprecedented. So you already know the drill. Let's do this. The only thing more fun than driving like a madman around the city is doing so in an anime-style open-world RPG game. More specifically, with the ability to do so on scooters, go-karts, luxury cars, sports cars, you name it. And the only place where you're able to do that is, of course, NTE. A game not just impressive in scale, but also impressive down to the most minute details. Whether it be NPC interactions, dynamic weather, or the fact that you can fully explore city buildings. You can choose to do so with full freedom, whether it be in first person or third person, either in solo or in multiplayer. There are endless things to do, and when the game launches on the 29th of April 2026, you'll be able to unlock an S-class character, Chiz, by simply leveling up. And my favorite part is the fact that there's no 50-50 mechanics on the gacha banner. You get the character you want, and that's it. So look, if that all sounds interesting to you, then make sure to get NTE today by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment. Thank you so much to NTE for sponsoring this video. All right, so to really understand how this all began, we have to go all the way back to the year 2013, when Steam, the beloved games platform on PC, would release Early Access, an absolute turning point in game development. It would allow you to release an incomplete game, charge money for it, and use community feedback to improve it with the hopes of releasing it one day. And while yes, this sounded great on paper, it was actually a program that was heavily criticized in the first few years after its release. For example, on March 20th, 2015, PC Mag had written an article titled 8 Early Access Video Games That Were Horrible Messes. Early access games sounded great, assuming that developers actually had an intention of completing them one day. However, some developers would release an early access game incomplete and would just abandon it or just stop working on it after people had paid money for it with the hopes of it releasing with full features one day. And while yes, for a while we did have to deal with a lot of early access slop, it really took some time for people to start to truly appreciate how amazing the early access program was for developers that needed it. This article from The Guardian uses the example of the game Kenshi. However, in this video, the amazing example of early access comes from the developer Unknown Worlds. Prior to Steam Early Access launching, they were mostly known for the game Natural Selection 2, a fast-paced multiplayer shooter that pits aliens against humans. Now, it wasn't mainstream by any means, it wasn't making millions of dollars, but it did have a community that appreciated it, and the developer had somewhat of a fan base because of it. Here's the deal though. This game had released around 2012, and it somewhat coincided with the release of Minecraft at the end of 2011. This was important because the director of Unknown Worlds, Charlie Cleveland, would note that in his opinion, Minecraft transformed the game industry and threw away all traditional challenge-oriented and progression-oriented games. He'd revealed that after the release of Natural Selection 2, the team felt exhausted, and it would prompt them to make a game inspired by Minecraft that involved them trying something completely new. So on December 2013, Unknown Worlds would announce an ocean-based game titled Subnautica, releasing concept art, just one image showing where the game would take place. At the time, the game was just a prototype, and Hugh Jeremy, the head of public relations at the studio, would literally say, "We just don't know what Subnautica is yet. We can't even point to specific genre. We just don't know." The only thing they knew was what was in the prototype. That it involved designing, building, and crewing up submarines, and that it would also, of course, be in first person. But look, at the time, this was a very interesting announcement because this was a developer who had already made a game that was loved by a community, who was hoping to tackle a very underutilized setting in gaming. The ocean, the water, right? Everything was above land in games, but this was open world under the water. It definitely piqued people's curiosity. And thankfully, people didn't really have to wait that long to see what this game was all about, because 1 year later, on December 2014, Subnautica would come out on Steam Early Access. And according to this article from Eurogamer, it would cost £15, a heavily discounted price for Early Access because today it costs €30 at full price. And even though it had come out in Early Access, this game was very well received. It was innovative, people loved where it was based, the gameplay was awesome, and you truly felt like you were getting value for your money. It very quickly became critically acclaimed. Overall, it would take the game around 3 years to go from early access to full release, launching on January 2018. And as you can see, by the incredible amount of positive reviews reaching overwhelmingly positive on Steam, this game did not in any way screw up its launch. If anything, it's one of the best examples in the entirety of the Steam library that show what early access can truly do. So it came as no surprise that barely 2 years after their full launch, they would have sold a total of over 5 million copies. An astounding number, especially for an indie developer. In fact, numbers like these are so rare to find that when they do happen, they start attracting a lot of attention. When you start making money and find success, people take notice, and that's exactly what happened here, because Unknown Worlds had caught the attention of the gaming conglomerate Krafton. What is Krafton? Well, they have like over a dozen different studios and a dozen different games. Most notably, they are the company behind PUBG Battlegrounds. And they were also the founders of Striking Distance Studios, the studio behind the game The Callisto Protocol, which wasn't really received that well, but still was a AAA game, I guess. This is a Korean company that is worth over $1.9 billion. They saw how successful Subnautica was, and they wanted a piece of that success as soon as possible. How soon, you might ask? Well, as soon as the end of 2021, barely a year after Unknown Worlds had announced that they had sold over 5 million copies of Subnautica, Krafton would swoop in and acquire the entire studio with 100% ownership stake for a maximum of $750 million. But now you're probably wondering, what do you mean for a maximum? Like, how much did they actually pay? Well, essentially, they had paid $500 million for the entire studio, right? They own everything the studio had ever done and ever will make. That's $500 million. And on top of that, they also added an option in the contract of offering an additional $250 million in earnings, depending on the achievements of Unknown Worlds after the merger. Now, at the time, this achievement was still unknown to the public, but Krafton and Unknown Worlds knew exactly what it was going to be: Subnautica 2. But they didn't just buy Unknown Worlds for that. They knew that there was still going to be many more sales to come for Subnautica 1. Because as recently as May 2025, Subnautica would come out on mobile, reaching an entirely different platform with many more sales. And by February 2026, Subnautica had sold over 18.5 million units. I mean, God, in comparison, Expedition 33 sold 8 million. And this is a widely critically acclaimed game that had won so many game awards. So what I'm trying to tell you here is that 18.5 million units is incredible. So Krafton had already made quite a bit of money thanks to this already. As for the co-founders of the studio, it made sense as to why they accepted the crazy $500 million deal. On Steam alone, this game had made over $274 million in gross revenue. But after adjusted regional pricing, discounts, refunds, the cut Steam takes, which is 30%, and the VAT plus sales tax, they had really made like around maybe $80 million. So $500 million to buy the studio outright, plus a chance at getting $250 million in bonuses, that's more than 6 times than what Subnautica made on Steam alone in net revenue. So it seemed like this deal was genuinely mutually beneficial. Both sides benefited and knew what they were getting themselves into, just like how every deal should be. And so as expected, around October 2024, Subnautica 2 Early Access would get announced, with a release date set for 2025. To Krafton, this was going to be their main money printing machine. This is what they placed all their bets on. If Subnautica 1 could sell over 18.5 million copies, then this was going to sell that and then some. And this wasn't based on delusion, it was based on facts. Steam allows you to wishlist games. That way your friends can see your wishlist, maybe gift them to you, but also more importantly, if you wishlist a game that hasn't come out yet, you get notified. As of today, by the time I upload this video, Subnautica 2 is the most wishlisted game on the entirety of the Steam platform. It was simply that highly anticipated. But as you already know, we're in 2026. This game was meant to come out in 2025. So what happened? Well, it turned out that Krafton had no intention of honoring their $250 million bonus deal. And one day, in the summer of 2025, the co-founders would all wake up to a random email telling them that actually their services are no longer needed because they're fired. On the 2nd of July, 2025, Krafton would put out a press release that came out of nowhere, saying Krafton announces gaming industry veteran Steve Papoutsis as new CEO of Unknown Worlds, specifying Papoutsis replaces the previous leadership team, Ted Gill, Charlie Cleveland, and Max McGuire, effective immediately. These are the 3 co-founders of Unknown Worlds. Krafton would then specify that they sought to keep them on, right? They tried their best to keep them, but that they wished them the best on their next endeavors. The CEO of Krafton, C.H. Kim, would then say, there is nothing more important than the gamer experience. Given the anticipation around Subnautica 2, we owe our players nothing less than the best possible game as soon as possible. And so, just like that, the game director, the technical director, and the CEO of Unknown Worlds were out and replaced by one person who, as far as we knew, had nothing to do with the studio. Additionally, this press release, as noted by Kotaku at the time, felt somewhat passive-aggressive. One paragraph in this press release that we didn't read was, as part of its oversight, Krafton is committed to achieving regular milestones to assess progress across its creative studios. These reviews, based on clearly defined metrics and targets, will help ensure that games meet both creative and quality standards. This process is essential to delivering the right game at the right time. Unknown Worlds' new leadership fully supports this process and is committed to meeting player expectations. So it really made it seem like these 3 co-founders were not doing a good job, like they screwed up and just couldn't make the game in time, not respecting the company's milestones. But by now, it was safe to say that if you were looking forward to the game releasing anytime soon, you probably weren't feeling too good knowing that the co-founders, the leaders of the studio, were let go so abruptly. This right here was a post made on the r/PC Gaming subreddit, now deleted, urging everyone to boycott the game's release, not buying it because of this. Seeing that the fan base was absolutely on fire and didn't even know what to believe anymore, Unknown Worlds would release their own statement a day later after all the firing, on July 3rd, 2025. This statement would re-emphasize that they're still confident with Subnautica 2, that they're fully supporting the new CEO that just arrived, and that this game that the team has been working on has not changed at all. The studio still includes the veterans that made Subnautica 1, and their commitment to this open development of early access Subnautica 2 has not changed. They'd end this by saying, nothing has changed with how the game is structured. It will remain a single-player experience with optional cooperative multiplayer. No subscriptions, no loot boxes, no battle pass, no microtransactions. So look, this was nice and all, but at the end of the day, Unknown Worlds is 100% owned by Krafton. This statement was most definitely approved by Krafton, if not written by them. so it didn't really do much to calm down the community. There were still theories floating around everywhere. But then, 2 days later, the user Flera, who was actually Charlie Cleveland, the fired game director of Subnautica 1 and 2, would make a Reddit post on the subreddit r/Subnautica. In it, he would reminisce about his journey with game development, how it started more than 25 years ago, how it all started with him making a Half-Life mod called Natural Selection 1. He would talk about his journey with the studio, how the community helped shape Subnautica 1, and how even with all this, they also failed making one game previously called Moonbreaker, and how he and the team learned from it. What's most interesting in all this statement, though, was what would come at the end. So you can see why, for Max, Ted, myself, the Unknown Worlds team, and for our community, the events of this week have been quite a shock. We know that the game is ready for early access release, and we know you're ready to play it. And while we thought that this was going to be our decision to make, at least for now, that decision is in Krafton's hands. After all these years, to find that I'm no longer able to work at the company I started stings. He would end this with a sentence saying, "And I also want you to know that this is not where the story ends." So barely a week into him being fired, things were starting to get very interesting and messy. Krafton, with their passive-aggressive messaging, were indicating that this was actually their fault for having been fired, that the game's milestones were not met, that it was pretty much behind schedule. But here, you had the game director himself and one of the co-founders say, actually, the game was ready. It was meant to come out on early access soon. So already, both sides of the story were so different. 4 days later, on July 9th, Bloomberg would release a bombshell of an article titled, "Krafton Delays Subnautica 2 Game Ahead of $250 million Payout." Now, Krafton would specify to Bloomberg this decision was not influenced by any contractual or financial considerations. But Bloomberg would specify the $250 million bonus was due to kick in if Unknown Worlds hit certain revenue targets by the end of 2025, according to the purchase agreement, which was reviewed by Bloomberg. By delaying Subnautica 2 into next year, the company is unlikely to hit those targets, and therefore the employees may not be eligible for a payout, the people said. Unknown Worlds leadership planned to share the additional money with all of the studio's employees, which number around 100. Staff who were at the company at the time of the acquisition were told they were eligible for bonuses ranging from hundreds of thousands to 7 figures, the people said. But Krafton would go further. They would start straight up attacking these founders, saying that 90% of the $250 million payout was allocated to those 3 co-founders. So they were pretty much revealing to everyone that the majority of this money was going to 3 people, that they weren't sharing it with the rest of the studio. Additionally, Krafton accused the executives of abandoning their responsibilities in order to work on other projects, including a film, leading to delays for the game. Their official statement would say, "We are deeply disappointed by the former leadership's conduct, and above all, we feel a profound betrayal by their failure to honor the trust placed in them by our fans." And during this very tumultuous week, the new CEO of Unknown Worlds would take questions from employees during a town hall. Someone would ask, "Did you guys delay this game to not pay out the bonus?" To which he would say, "It's a good question, and I would appreciate patience on this particular topic." He would then double down on the fact that they really want this game to release in an amazing state, that they take the game very seriously, which is why it was delayed. So look, the more we learned about what was going on behind the scenes, and the more Krafton released statements about this whole mess, it really was starting to feel like the bonus did have something to do with this. At the end of the day, Krafton wasn't the studio behind Subnautica 1. The co-founders were, though, and their story was so different from Krafton that it caused a lot of concern. By now, people really didn't know what the hell to believe. They were just sad that this game seemed like it was never going to come out. And speaking on the game coming out, on the same day the Bloomberg article would come out, Unknown Worlds would make a statement on their website saying, "An update on Subnautica 2 early access." Here they would reiterate that they got feedback for Subnautica 2 and that it simply wasn't ready to come out in 2025 as it was already planned. And so the new date for the early access release of the game was going to be in 2026, effectively delaying it by a year. In parallel, they would also showcase gameplay of the game, saying that this was their way of showcasing their confidence with how the game was coming along. But as people were barely starting to process the fact that the game was going to be delayed by a year, one day later, on July 10th, 2025, Charlie Cleveland, the ex-game director of Subnautica 2, would, on his own website, release a blog titled Lawsuit. In it, he would say, "Hello everyone. it continues to be an explosive and surreal time for the Subnautica team and community. None of this is what we wanted, but we truly appreciate the amazing support we've gotten from everyone and means a lot to us, especially now. As I wrote last week, he's referring to the Reddit thread, we know in our souls that the game is ready for early access. That's just how we roll, and we'd like nothing more than for you to play it. Game devs live for this, but it's not currently under our control. We've now filed a lawsuit against Krafton. The details should eventually become, at least mostly, public. You all deserve the full story. Suing a multi-billion-dollar company in a painful, public, and possibly protracted way was certainly not on my bucket list, but this needs to be made right. Subnautica has been my life's work, and I would never willingly abandon it or the amazing team that has poured their hearts into it. As for the earnout, the idea that Max, Ted, and I wanted to keep it all for ourselves is totally untrue. I'm in this industry because I love it, not for the riches. Historically, we've always shared our profits with the team and did the same when we sold the studio. You can be damn sure we'll continue with the earnout/bonus as well. They deserve it for all their incredible work trying to get this game into your hands. Stay tuned. Signed, Charlie. So I just like to point out something, right? This all happened in like barely 8 days. All right, they got fired on July 2nd, and this is happening on July 10th. As a Subnautica fan, you were waking up every single day with like a slap to the face. What the hell's happening? So this blog post re-emphasized the game was ready. It was meant to release. Krafton stopped us. And on top of that, the final paragraph here was a dig to the statement Krafton made about the co-founders, about the fact that they were intending to keep 90% of the bonus between themselves. Things were getting nasty very quickly. And so 6 days would pass, and Charlie would again make a statement, this time on Twitter, saying, "Hello everyone. The saga continues. In my previous post, I mentioned that there would be more to come. Well, today you can finally read the official complaint the original Unknown World shareholders have filed against Krafton. It's unfortunate we are here in this situation, but we're doing everything we can to make things right for everyone. Openness and transparency is my thing, so we're glad to bring this truth to light." It was official. The lawsuit was moving forward, and we had access to the complete complaint to see exactly what the problem was. The complaint itself was around 58 pages. It was uploaded on Scribd, I guess that's how you call the website, and it would be viewed by almost 100,000 people. So here, Charlie and the other two co-founders accused Krafton of deliberately sabotaging and delaying the game's release to avoid paying out the $250 million that was agreed upon during the acquisition of their studio. One of the concluding paragraphs here is really interesting. It would say, in short, Krafton flagrantly breached both the letter and the spirit of the promises at the very core of its agreement to purchase Unknown Worlds. It promised to leave creative and operational control in the hands of the founders. Promise broken. It promised to consult with the founders before taking any action that could harm the earnout. Promise broken. It promised not to take any action with the primary business purpose of frustrating the earnout. Promise broken. And it promised not to terminate the founders without cause. Promise broken. Why? Because Krafton knew that allowing the founders to launch Subnautica 2 as planned would generate enormous commercial success and require Krafton to pay the $250 million earnout. By firing the founders and delaying the launch, Krafton can capture, what's left of, the game's commercial success without paying the Unknown Worlds team a penny of the earnout. So as you can see, this accusation was not liked at all, and it was aired out to the public. Now everyone knew what was actually going on here. This went against the entire spirit of the acquisition, and it seemed like Krafton was playing very dirty. At the same time, during all this, someone would leak some internal slides from Krafton. It dated back to May 2025. And we can see Krafton's logic to delaying the entire game's release due to like barely a couple of things that were changed. 2 biomes were removed. A small amount of creatures were not there. Some equipment was reduced. A custom game mode was not there. And there was 1 narrative that was delayed. Due to these things, Krafton argued that this entire game needs to be delayed 1 year. Even though it was meant to release in early access. Even though Subnautica 1, when it first released in early access, barely had any of this. It had like maybe 1/10 of all the features. This gave even more ground to the argument that the founders were trying to make. When these slides leaked, Krafton would immediately make a response, saying, "The document that has been circulating on social media and reported by various outlets is indeed part of an internal milestone review conducted as part of Subnautica 2. Milestone reviews are conducted regularly in collaboration with Krafton's creative studios across all projects. These reviews help assess development progress, define clear objectives, and ensure that each project aligns with Krafton's standards in both creativity and quality. This process is central to Krafton's commitment to delivering polished, high-quality games at the right time." Thing is though, Part of the deal of acquiring Unknown Worlds is that they wouldn't interfere. This was not a decision that was up to them to make. And what went against this narrative was the fact that in the lawsuit made by the co-founders, you'd see a section saying, one of Krafton's El Segundo publishing employees reported to Gil, who was the CEO at the time, one of the co-founders, that Krafton headquarters told all Krafton teams to stop all creative tasks related to Subnautica 2. The employee supervisor even demanded that he and his team cease communication with Unknown Worlds altogether. So they went against every aspect of the acquisition, lied, and made the co-founders look bad as if they weren't working, and on top of that, were isolating the studio from being able to make progress. This is what was at stake here. And so the next step in all this would come almost a month later. On August 12th, 2025, Krafton would counter the lawsuit, arguing that actually the only people who broke this agreement were the co-founders. In this almost 102-page document, in which Krafton gets questioned a lot of questions and they answer, they would also make their case as to what exactly happened from their point of view. And they'd say, things fully veered off course by the spring of 2025. Unknown Worlds received extensive feedback from Krafton's internal publishing teams, which indicated that Subnautica 2 was not ready for release. Krafton's CEO warned the key employees that a premature early access release of a highly anticipated sequel like Subnautica could cause irreversible harm to the entire IP franchise, pointing to the sequel to Kerbal Space Program as a prime example. But as the end of the earn-out period drew nearer, the game was still nowhere near its planned scope. Indeed, as late as March of 2025, only 2 months before the key employees claimed the game was ready for the first early access release, the development lead for Subnautica 2 at Unknown Worlds noted that the first early access and second early access, planned for December 2025, would only be about 12% of our intended 1.0 scope, and joked that at that rate, we would be in development for 30 years. The key employees became desperate. If development of Subnautica 2 continued at its current pace, the key employees would miss out on 4 quarters of consecutive revenue they needed to maximize their earnout, which expired in June 2026. So see, this was new info. Bloomberg reported that they needed to make all this money by 2025. No, the deadline was actually June 2026. That was the deadline for making the most amount of money possible to qualify for that bonus. The lawsuit would continue. Cognizant of this and faced with a choice between their own monetary interests and the best interests of Unknown Worlds and the Subnautica franchise, the key employees insisted on moving forward with a premature early access launch of Subnautica 2. Krafton would then argue that they were so worried about the game flopping, that they were so worried about the game's reputation and disappointing fans, that they had no choice but to get rid of them and get things back on track. But the accusations wouldn't just end here. In Krafton's counter, they'd argue that when they told the co-founders that they were going to get fired, the co-founders said, well, hey, we'll just release it on our own. Fuck you. So they downloaded countless files related to the game and left with them. Krafton would claim that they stole the blueprint for Subnautica. Here's what they exactly said. The key employees refused, threatened to self-publish Subnautica 2, and, anticipating their termination, stole hundreds of thousands of Unknown Worlds and Krafton confidential documents before they were fired, presumably in furtherance of their plan to unilaterally self-publish Subnautica 2 and capitalize on the earnout. This was complete character assassination of these co-founders, right? Making them seem like they're money-hungry goblins that were willing to set everything on fire just to get that payout. So again, even though this was brought to court, we were faced with 2 very different stories. But unfortunately for anyone keeping up with this, for anyone wanting to see where this goes, they would have to wait some months before hearing back on what was going on, because this was heading to trial. Like, that's it. This was going to court. And so it wouldn't be until November 6th, 2025 that we saw an update to this, and it would be during a pre-trial brief. This typically happens after the discovery phase. So both sides had months to get documents, get proof, get anything to back up their claims. And what we would find here, I mean, objectively speaking, it didn't really make Krafton look any better. In fact, it made them look worse. This is actually the first time we see mention of ChatGPT during this whole debacle. But before we get to this, we have to understand just how crazy the things that were found about the CEO of Krafton truly were. PC Gamer summed things up nicely. In the pre-trial brief, the co-founders would allege that Changham Kim, the CEO of Krafton, was desperate to avoid paying them the bonuses required by their acquisition contract because of professional embarrassment that would result from the perception that he overpaid for the studio. Interestingly enough, the co-founders would also say that Krafton was fully aware of what was happening at the studio and even expressed support for it. On top of that, when it came to the claim that one of the co-founders abandoned development to focus on making a movie, the filing also claims that Krafton actually encouraged it. They would then go on to say, already concerned that Krafton had paid too much to acquire Unknown Worlds, Kim feared that making any earnout payment to founders would earn him a reputation as a pushover and endanger his position as CEO. Desperate to avoid such a professional embarrassment, Kim obsessed over finding a way to avoid Krafton's obligation to pay the earnout. The pre-brief claims Krafton head of corporate development Maria Park told Kim that Krafton would likely have to pay the earnout if sales targets were achieved, even if the studio heads were dismissed with cause. At that point, the CEO turned to artificial intelligence to help him brainstorm ways to avoid paying the earnout, the filing claims. ChatGPT likewise advised that it would be difficult to cancel the earnout. This is right here in the pre-trial brief, and there will be a footnote in the page saying Krafton did not produce the ChatGPT conversations and, when pressed, confirmed that they no longer exist. God, I wish we had them. Dude, someone contact OpenAI, please. Of course, a company representative would just say no when asked if the claim was accurate, saying that this is nothing more than a distraction. But what's crazy here is that they're also alleging that the CEO had created something called Project X, an internal company task force, all with the purpose of not allowing the co-founders to get that bonus. We would find out later that Project X and everything involving it was actually ChatGPT's idea. Like, no, at this point, I refuse to believe this guy earned his position. This has to be nepotism. How do you end up as CEO thinking that something like Project X is a good idea? Sounds like something that Elon Musk would do. This pre-trial brief also, through discovery, would get the Slack messages between CH Kim, the CEO, and Richard Yoon, the CFO of Krafton. Here we can see a conversation on the 27th of June, 2025, a few days before the firing. Richard Yoon would be saying, I had a phone call a little while ago. This time, the co-founders, are asking for $75 million for themselves and $40 million for the team members. They say they won't do it unless we negotiate the packages of the teams together. The bucket for the team members we are thinking of at present is $10 million. It might be easier to just take over, ... To which CH Kim, the CEO, would say, set a date and send a letter if you need to send it in advance. So this is when he would decide, all right, we're going to fire them and take over the studio. The last piece of the puzzle here that really paints the full clear picture is that Kim's contract as Krafton CEO was going to be up for renewal in 2026, which is why this whole thing was personal for him. He understood too late that this deal was actually not really good for him and his company, and he didn't want to lose his job. On May 2025, he even tried to gaslight Charlie Cleveland, the game director, telling him that paying the earnout would cause the value of the studio to drop significantly, and that he, as the person responsible for the investment, would have to take responsibility. Just outright embarrassing. And speaking of embarrassing, it gets worse. It gets humiliating. A few days later, on November 19th, 2025, Chang-Hen Kim, CEO of Krafton, would get questioned during a testimony for the trial. Here, he would admit, yes, he consulted with ChatGPT. It was actually his main legal advisor. He would say this even though a few days beforehand, during the pre-trial brief, a Krafton spokesperson would say, this didn't happen, it's just misinfo, you're trying to distract us from the main issue of the lawsuit. Here's what the CEO said. I started discussing this matter with various teams within the company to figure out what we could do. So I talked to the legal team, the finance team, and the corporate team, and the PR, all these various teams, and I also actually searched on ChatGPT to get faster answers to figure out what kind of rights we have. When asked why he would consult with ChatGPT on a matter like this, Kim said, I think, just like everyone else, I'm using ChatGPT to get faster answers or responses, just like Google search. The article from PC Gamer would say, during cross-examination, lawyers for the former Unknown Worlds principals also point out that in a June 2 message sent to Krafton head of corporate development Maria Park, Kim included a ChatGPT link and subsequently referenced the chatbot's advice directly. He'd say, now, ChatGPT is starting to answer that it is difficult to cancel the earnout. If so, this is a contract under which we can only be dragged around. The lawyers also point out that while that particular ChatGPT conversation was subsequently deleted, as was one about a no-deal scenario with the studio, others from around the same time still exist. On redirect, Kim said he deleted those queries because what I learned is that, from OpenAI, is that if you use certain important information concerning your company, then that type of information can be used by OpenAI for learning purposes. What a great excuse, dude. And you know what? The dog ate my homework yesterday too. The article will continue, it's all rather messy. Kim, who acknowledged making dozens of ChatGPT inquiries every day regarding general business at Krafton, said he was merely using it to research his options, as he would with any other search engine. But with hundreds of millions of dollars at stake, not to mention the future of one of Krafton's potentially most lucrative games, I would think that shareholders would expect more from their CEO than just kicking it around with a chatbot. And yeah, I mean, that's totally right. Like, what are you doing as a CEO? What is the leverage of having you around if you're just going to ask a chatbot about everything you're doing? I mean, at this point, why not just replace him with a premium subscription to ChatGPT, or maybe even better, Claude, an actual AI that works? And as the article points out, the fact that barely a few days beforehand, the company denied the CEO ever using ChatGPT, and now him admitting this doesn't look good for the case at all on their side. So here we were at the end of 2025, and the most wishlisted game on Steam was held hostage due to a lawsuit. And make no mistake, this whole thing had happened because the CEO of Krafton had made a bad deal. He signed off on it, and now he wanted to run away using ChatGPT as his mentor. Fans were losing hope that they were ever going to see this game, and things were not looking good for Krafton at the same time. Lawsuits like this are typically very messy and take years to be done. So it came as a shock, I think, to everyone when only a few months later, we would get the opinion of the vice chancellor presiding over this case. And to say that it would be humiliating for Krafton and its CEO would be an understatement. On March 16th, 2026, the vice chancellor overseeing this case in the state of Delaware would publish a 91-page opinion piece in which we can see the verdict outlined. TLDR, Krafton must return control to Subnautica 2 Studios CEO. However, when it came to Cleveland and McGuire, the chancellor would argue, Jill is reinstated as CEO of Unknown Worlds with full operational authority over the studio. Because restoring him vindicates the seller's operational rights, I decline to return Cleveland and McGuire to the peripheral roles they occupied before their terminations. Gil, with his authority restored, may proceed with the early access release of Subnautica 2 when he deems it appropriate. So what this means is, for now, bringing back Ted Gill as CEO is satisfactory enough for the founders to regain full control of the studio, which is what they wanted. When it comes to the other two co-founders, their roles weren't that impactful to begin with. Having Ted Gill come back as the CEO, as the guy who's heading the entire studio's decision-making processes, is enough to give them back full control and not allow Krafton to decide things for the studio anymore. And on top of this, the Vice Chancellor would specify, to ensure the specific performance remedy is not illusory, the base earn-out period is equitably extended by the duration of Gill's ouster. So that means for the entire time that Gil wasn't CEO, the clock wasn't ticking on the deadline for the bonus, which means he gets extra time to earn that payout. The sentence afterwards is also very important to note. It says, whether Krafton's actions wrongfully impaired the earnout and whether any resulting money damages are owed are reserved for the second phase of this litigation. So this lawsuit was not over. It's just that for now it was decided that yes, the co-founders need to get back control of the studio, it's in their right. But the question of whether Krafton deliberately wanted to sabotage the payout and whether the co-founders are owed additional money for the sabotage are reserved for the second phase of this litigation that will eventually happen. So this is far from over. This opinion piece would also talk about Project X, in which we'd understand more details about it, saying, at ChatGPT's suggestion, Kim formed an internal task force dubbed Project X. The task force mandate was to either negotiate a deal on the earnout or execute a takeover of Unknown Worlds. They looked to buy time. Kim would seek ChatGPT's counsel on how to proceed if Krafton failed to reach a deal with Unknown Worlds on the earnout. This is when the AI chatbot would come up with a response strategy to a no-deal scenario, which Kim would share with Yoon, the CFO. Here we'd see multiple steps outlined by ChatGPT, with step A being preemptive framing. Repeat that protecting quality and fan trust is the highest priority. Undermine the large corporation versus indie framing. Which is exactly what he did, by the way. B. Securing control points. Lock down Steam and console publishing rights and access rights over code/build pipeline through both legal and technical aspects. For the earnout freeze, keep room for negotiations through provisions stating immediate removal if specific development results are achieved. The Vice Chancellor would then say, over the next month, Krafton followed most of ChatGPT's recommendations. And that's what we saw earlier in the video. That's exactly what they did with their statements, saying, guys, we don't think the game is ready, we care about the fans, etc., etc. So look, this wasn't like an exaggeration, this wasn't clickbait in any way. Every single thing that happened after Kim had fired the co-founders was literally just him following what ChatGPT had told him. A CEO of a $1.9 billion company seeking advice from an AI chatbot in order to not pay $250 million that was part of a deal he signed off on. I swear to God, you cannot make this shit up. But here's the thing, if you think that this is where things ended, then you're horribly wrong. A day later, the temporary CEO, Steve Papoutzis, that now had to leave because Ted Gill was going to be reinstated, would share a message with the Subnautica 2 team. He'd thank everyone for the incredibly hard work, and he would announce that they had passed Krafton's milestone review just last week. Now they're ready to release in early access to the public. They were targeting May, and this information was leaked exclusively to IGN. This meant that from this point onwards, the game was set to release barely 2 months after the founder CEO was reinstated. Now this caused a big problem. The CEO, who had barely just came back, now was facing a new issue. Why the hell would you announce the release date of the game like this? He would again call up his lawyers and file a complaint against Krafton, saying this announcement was potentially damaging the game and sowing additional confusion among the Subnautica community. Krafton self-servingly announced the launch without any regard to its impact on the game, the team, or the community, let alone this court's opinion. Announcing the release of a game is momentous, and it is typically accompanied by significant marketing activity, fanfare, and community coordination. That entire process was supposed to be driven by Mr. Gill. However, in defiance of the court's opinion, Krafton has now taken that away, further damaging the game and sowing additional confusion among the Subnautica community. They were pretty much alleging that Krafton had intentionally leaked this to sabotage the game further, as a middle finger for losing the lawsuit. A month later, though, I swear this is a roller coaster, this complaint would be withdrawn. The lawyer of the CEO would ask the judge to toss the motion. I guess by that point, the founders just wanted the game to release in one piece. They were prioritizing the community and wanted to stop all these legal headaches. However, a day later, after withdrawing the motion on April 23rd, the publication game developer would reach out to the lawyers of the 3 co-founders for comment. They'd say that despite the unknowns, the future of Krafton and Unknown Worlds relationship will be a continued challenge. In quotes, it's going to be extremely hard to repair the relationship between Unknown Worlds leadership and Krafton, especially after such a humiliating court defeat. And this assumes that either party is interested in mending fences. So yeah, the lawsuit was done, the CEO was reinstated, it seemed like justice was handed, but Krafton still owned the studio, 100% of it. They still had to work together, and it was safe to say that this trust was gone permanently. I mean, come on, what was this? It was a failed hostile takeover. But hey, a week later, on April 30th, 2026, Subnautica 2's early access cinematic trailer would finally come out. And yeah, listen, regardless of everything, the hype is still there. Almost 2 million views, 30th trending for gaming, and an incredible like to dislike ratio. I mean, 125,000 likes, that's crazy. Looks like these executives are going to earn their bonus whether Krafton likes it or not. We would also find out that the game would finally be releasing on May 14th, 2026. In the end though, Krafton had spent such a long time crafting its image. After the incredible success of PUBG, they sought to acquire more studios, grow their business, and truly push the idea that they cared about both their communities and the games that they produce. With something like this, they had essentially tainted their reputation into being just another EA game, just another corporation obsessed with money that's willing to screw you over if it meant saving on giving you what's rightfully yours. For that, they can thank their wonderful CEO who decided to employ ChatGPT as his messiah, not even assistant, his messiah, and who'll make it very hard for the future CEO to make any deal with any company, because now they'll think, wait, are you just going to pull a Subnautica on me? And honestly, at this point, what's stopping them if the next CEO also uses ChatGPT? Guys, if there's a lesson to take from this, it's that everything in this world is good in moderation. You want to use AI to speed things up? Go ahead, dude, but giving it control over your life, allowing it to feed your own delusions, and refusing to use your critical thinking skills will only lead to catastrophe. This is what happened to the CEO of Krafton, and this is what will happen to anyone who places so much trust in an AI chatbot. Thank you so much for watching until the end. I really appreciate it. If you want to see exclusive content, like a couple of videos every month from me, as well as awesome art, then definitely check out stack.com. It's like Patreon, but better. And I'll see you in the next video, whenever that is. I love you so much. Platonically. Mwah.